Now that you're familiar with the basic built-in types in C++, let's look at a few different ways to declare and initialize variables. So I'm going to start by declaring a double called price, and we're going to set this to 99.99. Nothing new so far. But what if we want to declare a float? Well, we can declare a float called interest rate, and we set it to 3.67. And here at the end, we type the letter F, that is short for float. This is really important because if you don't type this, by default, the compiler will treat this number as a double, and then it will try to store a double inside a float variable. And this can potentially cause data loss. So when working with float values, always type an F at the end. It can be uppercase or lowercase. It doesn't really matter. Now, there is another reason we should type this letter. We'll come back to this shortly. Now, let's declare a long. So long file size. We can set this to 90,000. Now, similar to the float type, here we should add the L suffix, because if we don't type this, the compiler will treat this number as an integer. So to force the compiler to treat this as a long, we type either an uppercase or a lowercase l. Now, the lowercase l can be confused with the number 1, so the best practice is to use a capital L, okay? Now let's declare a variable for storing a character. So we say char letter, and here we use single quotes to represent a character, like A, okay? And finally, let's look at a Boolean. We're going to call this isValid, and we can set it to true or false. These are the acceptable values for Booleans. Now, with any of these types, we can also use the auto keyword to let the compiler infer the type of our variables. For example, if we change bool to auto and then hover our mouse over isValid, look, the compiler knows that isValid is of type bool. Similarly, if we change char to auto and look at the type of this variable, we can see it's of type char. Now, here's the interesting part. If we change long to auto, we can see that file size is of type long because we added the letter L at the end. If we don't type this and use the auto keyword, look, file size is treated as an integer. So that is why we need to add this suffix. Similarly, for float, if we use auto, now we can see interest rate is a float, but if we remove the suffix, it will be treated as a double, right? So this is the benefit of using the auto keyword. It kind of makes our code shorter and more consistent. You don't have to use it if you don't like it, but the auto keyword is particularly useful when working with more complex types. We'll look at that in the future. Now, there is one more way to initialize variables in modern C++ that you need to know, and that's called brace initialization. So let me delete all this code and declare an integer called number and set it to 1.2. Now here we get a warning because we have a yellow underline, but our code still gets compiled. So if we print number and run our program, we see the fraction part is gone and we see 1, okay? Now there's another way to initialize this variable and prevent this kind of scenario where we assign the wrong value to a variable. So instead of the assignment operator, we use braces. So we put this value inside braces. Now look, we have a compilation error because we have a red underline. So our code is not going to get compiled. The brace initializer stops us from making such mistakes. Now there is another benefit to using brace initialization. If we don't supply a value here, our number variable will be initialized to 0. So if we run this program, we see number is 0. However, if we remove the empty initializer here and run our program again, you can see we get this random value, which we say it's garbage. And every time we run our program, we get a different value. So this makes our programs unpredictable. So we should either initialize our variables using the assignment operator to a proper value, or we should use an empty brace initializer.